I'm Adam, a climate scientist with a PhD from Oxford, sharing what you need to know about climate change. And today you need to know what Bill Gates has been saying about climate action. Because frankly, there's plenty of legit points, but also plenty of half-truths, plenty of misleading statements, and contradictions. And on top of all that, there's been a lot of misleading coverage of what Gates is actually saying in the piece. This reaction to his piece might just be more alarming than any of the points he actually makes. And so stay tuned, I'm going to come back to that towards the end of the video. With that in mind though, let's get one thing straight from the start. Despite what you might have read, his article isn't an argument that climate change doesn't matter or isn't happening. While I definitely think he mischaracterizes climate change and gets a bunch of stuff wrong, more on that in just a second, he clearly says climate change is important. I mean, he even says, to be clear, to make it extra clear. To be clear, climate change is a very important problem. Every 1/10 of a degree of heating that we prevent is hugely beneficial because a stable climate makes it easier to improve people's lives. But that makes the argument that he is making in the piece even harder to understand, because ultimately he's arguing that we've been prioritizing climate change too much, which, frankly, as a climate scientist who is painfully aware of the vast chasm between what we need to do and what we are doing to stop climate change, well, is pretty galling. And even reading through this article 3 times now, it's hard to get my head around how he's justifying this. He argues that we've been led astray by a doomsday outlook on climate change. Now, certainly there are people who argue that climate change will doom us, but they aren't typically climate scientists. In fact, climate scientists like me spend a lot of our time pushing back against this doom narrative. And the thing is, arguing that climate change will not lead to humanity's demise is not particularly reassuring. As climate scientist Kate Marvell points out, we should aim for something better than not extinct. Climate change isn't some binary between doomsday and no big deal. The more we heat the planet, the more people who lose their livelihoods and their lives. Climate change will hurt all of us, but will not hurt all of us equally, with the most vulnerable the most affected. And Gates is right to point this out. But who's he pointing this out to? Because Gates isn't making this argument to reassure young people overwhelmed by climate anxiety. He ends up using this as an argument against climate policy. And you know who definitely doesn't have a doomsday outlook on climate change? Policymakers. Here's a map from Climate Action Tracker, one of the sources Gates uses in the piece. The green countries are the ones whose policies are compatible with keeping global warming under the incredibly important 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. And if you're thinking, but I can't see any green countries, well, that's exactly my point. But Gates makes the claim, with no real evidence to back it up, that people will be able to live and thrive in most places on Earth for the foreseeable future. This glosses over the vast damages to infrastructure and lives from extreme weather events like wildfires and tropical storms, food instability, restricted access to drinking water, the spread of infectious diseases to new, unprepared regions, or even the outbreaks of entirely new pandemics. Not to mention the societal instability that could come from all of this, as people are forced from their homes or forced to compete for scarce resources. Later he talks about the impact of extreme heat being such that some outdoor work will need to pause during the hottest hours of the day. This just substantially downplays the threat. Parts of the world will be uninhabitably hot at 2 degrees Celsius of warming, and we're currently heading for around 3 degrees of heating. And some outdoor work happens to include things like agriculture, which is kind of important for that whole eating food thing that we all like to do. Bill talks about how we can adapt to the conditions, saying it won't be cheap, but it will be possible in most cases. And while adaptation is a vital part of the equation, acting like we could or should solely adapt our way out of this mess misses out some very important factors. We're already seeing changes beyond our ability to adapt, and this problem gets substantially worse the more we heat the planet. How do you begin to adapt to sea level rise inundating hundreds of millions living near coasts, or disaster upon disaster decimating entire regions' ability to grow food, or the threat of entire ecosystems collapsing, like vital coral reefs, which are at risk of being virtually wiped out with the heating levels we're in for? Plus, as he acknowledges, the countries that will be worst hit have the least resources to adapt to the threat. And where adaptation is still possible, it becomes more and more expensive as the world heats, with many estimates indicating that it would become massively more costly than halting climate change. Which seems weird for him to leave out when the whole article is supposedly about spending our money as effectively as possible, as we'll see in just a moment. Oh, and while we're talking about spending money, I just want to point out that my videos don't ever sell you stuff you don't need with product placements or monetization. If you're into that, keep me doing it by becoming a patron up here, or all you climates who like, comment, and subscribe, you're helping massively too. Now, Gates says emissions projections have gone down, and with the right policies and investments, innovation will allow us to drive emissions down much further. Now, I agree with this, and it's a huge and important shift we've seen over the past decade, which will absolutely save lives. But it's important to emphasize that emissions projections are still way above any trajectory that scientists calculate would keep us, especially the most vulnerable among us, relatively safe. In fact, on our current trajectory, we keep emitting indefinitely and keep heating the planet indefinitely. Hardly an argument for complacency. But still, this sentence is fair enough. With the right policies and investments, innovation will allow us to drive emissions down much further, which makes the following sentence so bizarre. Unfortunately, the doomsday outlook is causing much of the climate community to focus too much on near-term emissions goals. So we need the right policies, but policies that address emissions today are the wrong policies. That's like saying we need to do something to avoid our car crashing into this wall and then complaining that we're applying the brake too eagerly. So why does he think we're focusing too much on this? Because it's diverting resources from the most effective things we should be doing to improve life in a warming world. This is really the crux of the piece. This idea that by spending on climate action today, we're not spending on protecting people from poverty and from disease. But I would say two things to this. Firstly, the countries that are cutting spending on international aid aren't doing so because they're too scared of climate change. They're doing so because they're trying to stop spending money supporting lower income nations. The most obvious example is the US. I'm pretty sure Trump, the guy who's repeatedly dismissed basic climate science, isn't gutting aid because he's scared about a climate doomsday scenario. There are also countries like the UK, which are trying to avoid spending money by double counting money as both international aid and climate finance. And secondly, who is he even arguing against here? Where are these countries prioritizing climate change too much? Honestly, I would love to meet them. Now, Gates does acknowledge that climate change is integrally linked to health, but then still somehow constantly talks as if it's one versus the other, which frankly is quite hard to untangle. And the truth is, you can't untangle climate change from other threats. It makes every single other threat we care about so much worse, including poverty and disease. Later, he spells out some examples of how he thinks these diverted resources have hurt us, arguing that by stopping financing fossil fuel projects, we've made it harder for low-income countries to get low-interest loans for power plants that would bring reliable electricity to their homes, schools, and health clinics. This neglects to mention that renewable projects are now cheaper than their fossil fuel counterparts in 90% of cases, and that falling prices in batteries also mean that you can affordably get consistent supply with renewables in many parts of the world. But it also fails to take into account air pollution. In fact, for me, this was one of the most glaring omissions of the entire piece. I mean, he's arguing about the apparent tension between climate action and health, and doesn't mention air pollution one single time. Seriously, I had to do Control F on the article to make sure I hadn't missed anything. Air pollution kills 8 million globally every year. That means 1 in 8 deaths are due to breathing in toxic air. If that sounds like a vast number, well, it is. And at the end, I'll link to my video explaining why it's so high. Burning fossil fuels are behind around half of these deaths. And so arguing that we need to weigh up fossil fuel projects by balancing long-term climate goals and short-term health goals is, to be blunt, nonsense. Fossil fuels aren't just killing us due to climate change today, with much more suffering in the future. They're also killing us in the millions right now due to air pollution. And this is an absolutely wild thing not to mention at all in a lengthy piece all about weighing up climate action and efforts to address poverty and disease. But it gets wilder. Gates tells a particularly revealing story that is meant to show just how bad focusing on climate, and only climate, can be. I'll read it in its entirety. A few years ago, the government of one low-income country set out to cut emissions by banning synthetic fertilizers. Farmers' yields plummeted, there was much less food available, and prices skyrocketed. The country was hit by a crisis because the government valued reducing emissions above other important things. It's weird that he doesn't mention what country it is, right? Because if he did, it would be easier to Google, or Bing, that the country, Sri Lanka by the way, didn't ban synthetic fertilizers to cut emissions. They did so, albeit misguidedly, to try to save money and protect against health concerns. So this wasn't some climate action. This ban was done for exactly the things that Gates is saying we should prioritize, addressing poverty and disease. Shout out to friend of the channel, Tim Baxter, for his excellent piece drawing attention to the massive contradiction in this statement. Gates argues throughout against policy that sets emissions targets and instead emphasizes that we need to focus on innovation. Now, certainly we need more innovation. But the hippies at the International Energy Agency estimate that we already have the tech to get us 2/3 the way to net zero, with the rest in the works. While some of these technologies might cost more upfront, this transition saves the world money overall by protecting against air pollution and limiting the devastating impacts of climate change. Something that Gates glosses over when he talks about the green premium. As I mentioned, Gates notes that our emissions forecasts have gone down, and this is true and this is great. But he leaves out that a major driving force has been countries setting up specific policies and emissions targets. Instead, according to him, it's all innovation, innovation, innovation. Solar and wind have become remarkably cheap. He acknowledges this, but that's been driven by countries incentivizing installations with policies which have in turn massively driven down prices as production has soared. Yes, innovation has played a role in this process, but it's certainly not the only, or at this stage, the leading role. If all we needed was the right tech, and solar and wind and batteries are now so cheap, why are emissions still not falling? Yeah, it's because we actually need policy that actively shifts our economies away from fossil fuels. We can't just hope that making the right techs cheap enough will magically make the world abandon all their fossil fuel infrastructure. In fact, Gates singing the praises of solar and wind as an example of how great tech can be is pretty galling. Not that I disagree, I mean my last video was all about how wonderful solar can be, not just in lowering emissions, but in supporting infrastructure and ecosystems. But the thing is, just 10 years ago, Gates was saying that solar and wind sucked in order to make a case for, yeah, you guessed it, innovation. So look, no one disagrees that we need some innovation, but we can't just innovate our way out of this. We need concrete actions and policies to actually put those innovations to use. And throughout this piece, Gates is arguing against policies that would push us to make use of the innovation that we already have today. So to sum up, while this piece does acknowledge that climate change is real and that it matters, it simultaneously does a lot of work to downplay the threat and to discourage action. It massively minimizes the consequences of the warming we're in for. It talks time and time again as if climate action is something separate from action to protect against disease and poverty, even though climate change, disease, and poverty are all interwoven. It argues that more fossil fuel power would be saving lives today, while neglecting to mention that millions are dying every year due to the toxic air produced by fossil fuels today. It pretends that the reasons we're not acting on disease and poverty enough are because the world's leaders have bought into a climate doomsday narrative and are acting with too much immediacy on climate change, despite the fact that no country's climate action is on track. It argues that climate solutions are too expensive, while ignoring how much money inaction would cost us. It argues that we can adapt our way out of the issue, while ignoring how much more expensive and ineffective that would be. And it claims that the only way out of the situation we're in is innovation, despite the fact that we already have the majority of the tech we need, and global emissions still aren't falling. So yeah, there's a reason I haven't heard a single climate researcher I know singing the praises of this piece. In fact, almost everyone I'm aware of is audibly groaning right now. So why did he write it? Well, of course, it's impossible to tell what's going on in the software inside Bill's head. But it doesn't seem like a coincidence that he's arguing against short-term climate targets while Microsoft is massively missing their targets. And of course, that fail is only going to get more epic as the company goes all in on energy-intense artificial intelligence. Gates conveniently fails to touch on this source of growing emissions, instead just arguing that AI will play a vital role in all that magical innovation that's going to solve all our problems. And I'm not saying AI won't provide valuable insights, but you've got to at least acknowledge that that's coming with a massive emissions trade-off. Actually, I guess you don't got to acknowledge that because Bill didn't. But look, I don't know why he wrote it, and ultimately it doesn't matter what his motivations were. The fallout is the same. It's just so frustrating reading it because it's so unbelievably tone deaf of the moment that we're in. A moment when the world's biggest historic emitter, the United States, is openly pushing back on climate action and gutting climate science. At a moment when it's becoming clear we're going to overshoot the 1.5 degree limit, a limit in place to protect the poorest within our nations and the poorest nations. And in this situation, what does Gates do? He argues that we're taking climate change too seriously. And of course, we're already seeing people jump on this, everywhere from conservative think pieces to the comments sections. Those who deny climate science are rejoicing at the idea that Gates is saying we should shift priorities away from climate change. And they are entirely glossing over why Gates is arguing that, namely that he thinks we should be giving more to protect people from poverty and disease. And that's my deepest concern about this piece, that it's going to do absolutely nothing to encourage leaders to spend more money protecting people from poverty and from disease. Instead, it's going to give yet another BS talking point to those who want to take money away from climate action, action that is trying to keep the world as livable as possible for the most vulnerable among us. So yeah, at the end of the day, this article is, to use the scientific language, a dumpster fire. What it's arguing for doesn't make sense, and the arguments it uses are often fundamentally flawed. And given the political moment we're in, it was inevitable that this argument was going to be taken out of context to add to a rising tide of pushback against climate action. The truth is, though, that climate change is hurting us today. Acting on it will save lives and save money. We have the technology to get us on track, but we're not implementing that tech anywhere near fast enough. And while there has been progress, emissions still aren't falling, and our current path will see us massively overshoot the limits that we've set to keep ourselves relatively safe. I've touched on just how interconnected health and climate are, and my next video is going to be all about how the climate crisis is a health crisis. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and in the meantime, here's how the things causing climate change, burning fossil fuels and destroying nature, are directly killing millions every year right now. Okay, until next time. Bye. Hector Kainst, blah blah.